Hey guys, this is Meredith from the Witty Gritty Paper Co. And today we're going to be starting a new series on the channel here, and it's called Watercolor Exercises for Beginners. And today is going to be part 1. And I'm really excited about this series. I really think that there aren't enough suggestions for beginners on just to improve their skill just with the medium, not necessarily painting anything in particular, just getting better at understanding the basics. So today we're going to be focusing on transparency, or as I like to call it, color control. I know, like, more common name is transparency, but I feel like color control is more descriptive of what we're actually going to be doing. Okay, so you should be able to see this. I hope you can see it. I've drawn 5 equal rectangles on my piece of watercolor paper here. I just used a ruler and a mechanical pencil, nothing fancy. And also, if you need to erase, make sure you use high polymer erasers on watercolor paper. It's really nice. It doesn't scuff up the paper, so that's just a little extra tip there for you. And the reason I've drawn these is this is how we're going to demonstrate transparency or color control. So the only real thing to keep in mind when you're drawing these is don't draw them right next to each other. I think you can see it. I've left some space in between each of them when I drew them, and that's essential because otherwise when you're painting, if they're right next to each other, they might bleed into one another as you're painting, or you'd have to wait for them to dry, like each one to dry, and then the exercise would take you hours, which kind of defeats the purpose. So don't draw them right next to each other. But other than that, this is not a big deal, easy step, and you can customize it to whatever you prefer. You can make your rectangles smaller, you can make them squares, whatever you want. You can use a smaller piece of paper, whatever you guys want. So for today's exercise, we're only going to use one color, and the color that I'm using, you do not have to use the same color, but the color that I'm using is a Daniel Smith color. And here it is. It's called Perylene Violet. And for all you Daniel Smith fanatics out there, you have to forgive me if I pronounce it incorrectly, but it looks right to me, so I'm going to say Perylene Violet. And I love this color. I got it pretty recently, and it is just so rich and pigmented. It's so beautiful. And for this exercise, I strongly recommend that you pick a color that is very deep and intense and dark. Don't use like a Winsor lemon. I don't recommend it. If you're really set on doing a lighter color like a yellow, then what I would say is do the exercise first with the dark color and then do it with the light color. And the reason I don't recommend the light color is because, first of all, it makes it a lot more challenging to do what we're going to do. And second of all, I don't think you learn as much. So I would say pick any dark color you have. It doesn't have to be Perylene Violet, but whatever you've got that is dark. So what we're actually going to be doing today, I should probably have gotten to that first, right? What we're actually going to be doing today is creating 5 distinct different shades out of one watercolor. In my case, Perylene Violet. And what this teaches you is basically just understanding the ratio of paint, pigment, and water in your brush, which is just essential in watercolor. When you really get familiar with it, you can just do so much. And I think that it's a common sort of place where beginners get tripped up is learning just the very basic principle of how much water to use. So this is very useful. I definitely recommend it. Even if you aren't a beginner, if you've never done this before, I think it's very effective. I'm pretty sure that I've heard that it's like the first thing that they teach you if you take a watercolor class. Obviously not every watercolor class, but if you took a local watercolor class or even an online watercolor class, this might be one of the very first things that they would teach you, because it's so important to doing bigger paintings, to doing layers. It's just a very basic skill that I think you really would be very, very helpful to master. So I personally am going to start with the darkest shade that I can make. You could start with the lightest shade if you're more comfortable with that. I've always been more comfortable with doing dark colors first, which is kind of contrary because in watercolor you usually work light to dark, which I do in paintings, but today I'm going to work dark to light just because that is how I think it is easiest for me. And I'm using my number 14 round brush today, but I've also got my number 8 round brush out because I'm not necessarily sure that I want this bigger one for the whole painting. Probably, maybe not though. This is essential. Make sure you have this with you when you do this exercise. Sample sheet. You need to see what these colors look like before you drop them down there. I think it'll save you a lot of headaches if you do that, because if you drop down a color that isn't right, it's going to be very hard to fix in this case, because this isn't a painting where you add layers and use all sorts of extra techniques to make it beautiful. This is just you and the paintbrush. It's just one single layer, and you have a more limited shot to get it right. So I would say definitely have a sample sheet out. All right, so I think we'll paint this darkest one together here. I'm just going to start in my corner and be as precise as I can. This is a nice newer round brush, so it comes to a nice fine point still. And like I said, these don't have to be rectangles. You can do whatever you want. And I actually wouldn't worry too much about staying 100% within the lines. You're really here to learn about color control and not detail painting, which of course is another good skill to master, but that's just not what we're learning today. Oh, I just love this color. It's like wine almost. It's just such a rich, pretty color. I was so excited to find it because I actually got it while I was on vacation, because they don't have it in my local art store, but I found an art store that was like glorious down in Florida where I was vacationing, and they had it. It was very exciting. So I thought this would be a perfect thing to use it for, since it's such a rich color. Now, particularly when you're doing darker shades, make sure you keep moving that brush. You do not want to have any hard edges. You don't want to let the edge dry by being too fussy with it. Okay. I think that is pretty much like that. I'm sort of looking at the side of it here to make sure it's still shiny enough for me to work in some of these areas. If your paper is still shiny, you should still be able to work in it. I think maybe one more thing, and then I'm going to leave it alone. With these dark shades, it can be so tempting just to keep going over them, to keep evening them out, but you really want to leave them alone after a certain point. They will figure it out by themselves. Okay. And another thing I want to stress is when you're doing this exercise, you want to use very clean water. Just get new water for it. Don't use anything you've been using before. And the reason is you really don't want to muddy this. This is all about learning how much water to use. And if your water is muddying up your shades as you're doing it, it's just going to throw you off. I actually heard a really interesting rule of thumb the other day for how clean your water should be. And it was, let's see if I remember. It was, if you wouldn't put a goldfish in it, then you shouldn't paint with it. So I think that's actually a pretty good way to remember. I'll probably be the first to admit, though, that I'm sure I've painted with water that would have killed fish, but I think it's a good tip for beginners to always keep your water about that clean, particularly for this exercise. Okay, so I've done this darkest one now, and I think what I'll do is paint the next 3 and speed up the footage so you guys don't have to listen to me ramble for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back together and we'll paint the lightest one. Okay guys, so I've gone ahead, I've finished painting these three in the middle, and now I thought we would do this last lightest one together. And I just want to say here that I think most people might think that the darkest one and the lightest one are the hardest ones. And I would say that's a definite no. These three in the middle are definitely the most challenging. They're going to trip you up the most. And unfortunately, there's really no way to explain how to get them right. There's really no way to teach this. This is where the learning and the experience comes in these three in the middle, because you have to make a judgment call. I think it's easier to tell if a color is as dark as you can get it or as light as you can get it, whereas in the middle here, it's much more of a personal judgment call. You got to make that decision on whether or not the color is a good, what word am I looking for? I don't know, a good scale of going from darkest to light. So, you know, that's okay. If you get these three in the middle kind of wrong, if you botch it, that's totally normal. I definitely did not get this right the first time I did it, probably the first few times I did it, because I've done this a lot. Whenever I become sort of disenchanted with just painting a little bit, you know, sometimes you just get a little less enthusiastic about it. Then I do this and I remember why I like it, because I love the challenge of it. And you definitely have to be decisive. So anyway, these three in the middle, I think personally, are always going to be the hardest. So don't feel bad if you have a hard time with them. And also, if you're doing this exercise, don't use your most expensive paper, because, you know, honestly, you don't need to. It's just an exercise. Don't break out your Arches paper for this. It'll really just be kind of a waste. So that's another tip to feel better when something doesn't work out 100%. Well, if you didn't use your most expensive supplies, then it's harder to feel bad about it. So that is my opinion on the matter. All right, so I'm mixing my lightest shade here. And I think, I want to make sure I have enough of it, but I think that a common sort of misconception about watercolors is that the water is actually part of the paint. So this really isn't true. The water holds the paint in suspension. So the water, you have to think of it like a little vehicle for the paint. It's not actually part of the paint. It's just sort of a way to transfer the paint. Because when the paint dries on your paper, the water evaporates away and leaves the pigment behind. So the water is just a temporary part of the piece, but it's also what makes watercolor so distinct and amazing. So the reason I mention it is because particularly when you do these lighter colors, you might notice that your paint looks a little like granular or sedimentary. You might notice that you can actually see the little pieces of pigment in suspension when they're drying. Oops, got a drop. Just sop that up. Particularly if you're using certain colors, since each watercolor is made from a different ingredient to get that color, some of them are going to be sedimentary looking, like even more so, and then some of them are going to be more staining. And for example, ultramarine blue is a very sedimentary watercolor. So if you were using ultramarine blue here, you might see the actual little granules of paint as your work dries. And for this lighter strip, it's basically just the exact same principle as we used for the darkest strip, except for it's the opposite. Instead of using the least amount of water as we could, as with this dark one up here, we're going to use the most amount of water that we can use. Like I said, without it being clear, without it being granular. Granular? Hopefully I'm saying that right. Having kind of an off day for pronunciation, I guess. Okay. And since this is my cheaper paper, you know, full disclosure, this is not my most expensive paper. It's an exercise. I don't want to use my most expensive paper for it. I am seeing buckling in my paper. If you can see where my color has pooled a little here and here, that's because it's cheaper paper. Now it would be, the buckling would be even worse had I not masked this down. Masking it down helps a lot. So if your paper buckles, you know, not a big deal. Just take a dry brush or a thirsty brush and just suck up some of that color. And I did this with my other strips of color too. All I would say is be careful in the darker colors because you don't want to like blot paint off. You can just remove it a little, and you don't even have to remove it. I don't like puddles. What can I say? All right. I gotta say, I'm really happy with this. Well, first of all, I love this color. I'm very happy with the color, but I'm happy with the exercise. I hope you guys can see the color. I hope it's turning out right. It's sort of this reddish purple. It's very pretty. So I hope that rings true on camera. But anyway, I really hope this has taught you something today. I'll definitely admit that I am somebody who doesn't really like technical exercises. I'm usually the one that's like, let's get to the fun part, guys. So, but this one is different because as soon as you get pretty good at it, I mean, you might be great at it the first time, I don't know, but as soon as you're good at it, it can be, the challenge of it can be very fun. So it's not just a boring technical exercise. I don't think I'd have the heart to recommend that to you because I don't like those either. So I do hope you try it. I really think that it would help, particularly for beginners, obviously. So watch out for the next video in this series. I'll have that coming up soon. And please like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. If you want to see more of it, feel free to leave me a comment in the comment section if you've got an idea or suggestion or anything like that. I'd love to hear from you guys. And I would absolutely appreciate it and love it if you would check out any of the links at the end of this video to see more of my work. All right, guys, so thank you so much for watching. And I hope you learned something. I'll see you soon. Bye.